Hi, friends. We are on week 5 of our journey with Jesus. And this week's lesson is, what is God's call for my life? Have you ever had somebody ask you, what do you want to do when you grow up? That's sometimes a really hard question for kids because you're just kids. You have a long time before you're going to grow up, and it's hard to know what you're going to do. But guess what? I've got a little secret for you. Even adults wonder what God has called for their life. What are they going to do when they grow up? We have to be really careful that we're listening to God and know what his plan is. So let's dig into our belief storybook. Think, act, and be like Jesus. And let's look at this question a little deeper, okay? This wonderful world in which we live belongs to God. He created it. He is the owner. Our job is to take good care of it. But did you know that it's not just the earth that belongs to God? In the Bible, Psalm 24 has a beautiful verse that says, "The earth belongs to the Lord, and so does everything in it. The world belongs to him, and so do all those who live in it." Wow. Does that mean that you belong to God? Yes, you do. Does that mean that everything you have and everything you own really belongs to God? Yes, it's true. Before we find the answer to the question, what is God's call in my life, we have to begin to understand that our lives are not really our own at all. Our lives belong to God. And Hannah and Samuel's story teaches us just that. So we're going to go into the Old Testament of the Bible in 1 Samuel 1 through 28 and 3 1 through 11. That's where this story comes from. And we're going to learn about Hannah, who loved God. She was sad, for she had no children. Each year, her husband took her to a place called Shiloh, and Hannah prayed a special prayer that God would give her a child. One year, she prayed, "Dear God, if you will only give me a son, I will give him back to you to serve you all of his days." She prayed so hard that her mouth moved, but no words came out. The priest asked her if she was drunk. "No," she said, "I'm pouring my heart out to my God." "May you find favor in God's eyes," said the priest. The following year, Hannah's prayers were answered. She had a new baby boy named Samuel. She happily cared for Samuel until he was old enough to leave her, and then she kept her promise to God and took Samuel to live with the priests in Shiloh. God gave Hannah many more children, and Hannah was pleased to know that Samuel was growing up in Shiloh, where he would love and serve God always. One night in the temple, Samuel heard someone call his name. He sat up and he rubbed his eyes. He thought Eli, the priest, had called him, so he ran to Eli. "Here I am," Samuel said. Eli said, "I did not call you. Go back to bed." A while later, Samuel heard his name being called again, and he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am." Eli shook his head. "I did not call you. Go back to sleep." A third time Samuel heard his name called. He ran to Eli again. "Here I am." Eli finally understood. He said, "God is calling you, Samuel. Go to sleep. When you hear your name called again, answer, 'Your servant is listening.'" That's exactly what Samuel did. God called Samuel again that night, and Samuel listened. Samuel shared what God said to him with the people, and Samuel did God's work the rest of his life. Wow, wasn't that an interesting story? Let's jump to Jesus. It must have been so hard for Samuel to live to give it must have been so hard for Hannah to give Samuel back to God. But Hannah knew something special. Hannah knew that Samuel did not really belong to her. Samuel belonged to God. When Hannah gave Samuel back, she was really giving back what already belonged to God. And how wonderful for little Samuel to be called by God. Now, if you belong to God, He calls out to you too. God calls us, no matter how young or old we are, to find ways to give back to Him. One day, Jesus did this with many people. We're going to read a story that I've had in my cupboard for a while, and it tells us just this point. The legend of the three trees. Life burst into the world on the third day of creation. From under the water, God brought forth the earth. Peeking up through the earth's soil, green plants waved like millions of tiny flags. Grasses, bushes, and trees grew into every size and shape. The trees towered above all. There were pine trees and poplar, olive and oak, willow and walnut. Each held its own seeds and fruits. Their seeds and fruits scattered as animals carried them from the trees. In a green valley, a fox dropped an olive pit. Along a rocky shore, a stork a, split open an acorn. On a tall mountain, a goat accidentally shook loose a seed from the pine cone. The pit, the acorn, and the seed grew into saplings. Watered by the rain and warmed by the sun, they reached upward. In time, a beautiful olive tree blossomed in the valley. A mighty oak stood on a rocky coast, and a tall pine tree stood on the mountain. As each tree grew, it dreamed of what it could become. The olive tree dreamed of becoming a beautiful and important treasure chest. Decorated with sparkling jewels, it would hold the greatest treasure in the world. One day, when a woodsman came to the forest, it seemed that the olive tree's dream would come true. The woodsman chose the olive tree from all the other trees. The olive tree trembled with happiness. At last, it would become a beautiful treasure chest. The woodsman took the olive tree to his workshop. He cut the wood into boards and hammered them into a box shape. But, to the tree's surprise, the woodsman did not make a box into a treasure chest. He did not polish the olive tree's fine wood or fill the box with gold. Instead, he dragged that box into a stable with messy sheep, smelly cows, and noisy chickens. The woodsman filled the box with hay. The olive tree saw that it had become a manger, a mere feeding box for animals. It knew then that it would never hold a treasure. As the olive tree's dream faded into the dusty stable, the oak tree looked out over the water with a dream of its own. Strong and proud, it dreamed that its mighty trunk would be made into a mighty ship that would carry a king. One day, shipbuilders cut down the oak tree and hauled it to their boatyard. They sawed the broad trunk into boards. They bent the boards to form the sides of the boat. With each passing day, the oak tree felt certain that its dream was coming true. But when the shipbuilders were done, the oak felt small and weak. It had not become a mighty ship at all. Instead, it was a little fishing boat launched on a calm lake. The mighty oak knew then that a king would never sail in a little fishing boat. High on the mountainside above the oak boat, the pine tree stood tall. Many times it saw people in the valley looking up. The pine tree hoped its towering branches would remind people of the glory of God's creation. It dreamed it would always stay on the mountain and point people to God. One night, a fierce storm shook the mountain. The pine tree bent and swayed in that powerful wind. As thunder boomed, a bolt of lightning flashed from the sky and splintered the tree's trunk. With a sound almost as loud as thunder, the pine tree crashed to the ground. The pine tree's dream crashed down with it. No one would ever look up to it again. Its long trunk now just blocked the mountain road. The tree thought that things could not possibly get worse, but then strong soldiers hauled it to the scrap yard. Unused and forgotten, the pine lay on a heap of old lumber. It knew then that a piece of scrap wood would never point people to God. Many years passed. The tree's great dreams seemed so far away that they stopped thinking about them. For what greatness could come to a feed box, a fishing boat, or a scrap of wood? But God had his own plan for each of the trees. One night, shepherds keeping watch over their flock saw an angel. A great light shone all around. The angel told them not to be afraid, for their Savior had been born in Bethlehem. Just as the angel had said, the shepherds found the baby lying in a manger. The olive tree had not become a treasure chest, but now, as a manger, it held the greatest treasure of all time, God's only Son, Jesus. The infant Jesus grew into a man, and the man traveled to the very lake that held the oak fishing boat. One day, the little boat carried Jesus onto the lake with the fishermen. Suddenly, a great storm swept over the lake. Water washed into the boat. The oak boat struggled with all its strength so that it would not sink. "Quiet, be still," Jesus said, and the storm stopped. The oak boat felt Jesus' power. The boat had never carried a king of this world, but now it carried the King of Kings. The pine tree knew nothing of Jesus or his miracles, but one morning it heard angry voices in a distance. "Crucify him!" the people yelled. Soldiers came to the scrapyard and grabbed the forgotten pine. The pine tree expected to be cut into firewood. Instead, the soldiers cut its trunk into two pieces to make a cross. And then they laid the cross on Jesus' back. On a hillside under the blackening sky, the pine cross swayed as the soldiers raised it. It did not know whether it could bear the weight of the man upon it. The pine tree had wanted only to point people to God. Now it knew it would become a sign of death. Jesus died that day to take away the sins of all who believe in him. He was taken down from the cross and laid inside a tomb, and then a wondrous thing happened. 3 days later, Jesus rose to life again, and so Jesus fulfilled his heavenly Father's plan for him. And what of the three trees? They too had fulfilled God's plans for them. Miraculously, God's plans had taken them beyond their youthful dreams. The olive wood manger had held the greatest treasure of all, God's beloved only Son. The oak fishing boat had carried the King of Kings, God's Son, during his work on earth. And to this day, the cross points people to God as a symbol of his great love for us. Sometimes the dreams that we have for ourselves are much smaller than the dreams that God has for us. The three trees' dreams had came true, just not in the way they imagined. And so it is with each of us. For if we follow God's path, we will travel far beyond even our greatest dreams. And that's the end, my friends. God does have great plans. He created each one of you, and He knows what His plans are for you, and He's given the gifts you need to fulfill those plans. And so one day, the greatness of God will be shown through you. I hope you'll have a wonderful day.